and welcome to another episode of Frick 5. I'm so excited about our guest today, Emerson Bowyer, who is the Associate Curator, the Searle Associate Curator of European Sculpture and Painting at the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome, Emerson. It's nice to see you. A lot of people will remember the major exhibition at the Met Breuer in 2018, Like Life, Sculpture, Color, and the Body, 1300 till now. Emerson was a co-curator of that great exhibition. And closer to the Frick's heart, Emerson was a curatorial fellow in 2013 with it, 2011 to 13 with a great exhibition on David d'Angers. Emerson and I go back many, many, many moons. We were together at graduate school at Columbia for many years. So it's nice to see you again. I hope everything's going well in Chicago.
Yes, everything is fine. I'm, going a little stir crazy in my apartment. It's nice to see you virtually.
Nice to see you. And I hope that these questions can offer a little diversion for you as it will to everybody watching. So why don't we dive in for the first question?
Sure.
What is the work of art or museum that changed your life?
I remember searching long and hard for a subject for my undergraduate thesis. And I looked at all the big names and all artists that I love. I'd spent a lot of time on Impressionism. And I came across Gustave Caillebotte, who is not an artist, or wasn't in the early 2000s, who was yet particularly famous. There'd been some great work done on him by scholars like the late Kirk Varnedoe or the Art Institute of Chicago had done a very famous retrospective. But he wasn't particularly well known to me. And works such as this, which is Young Man at His Window, it was exhibited at the Second Impressionist Exhibition, 1876. Absolutely blew my mind. It was not the Impressionism that I knew.
Right.
It looked nothing like a Monet or a Renoir.
You don't see this on a mug or a pillowcase, right?
No, exactly. And then I looked at the size of the painting, which is, quite large and utterly unexpected for the sort of size of an artwork that was being made by Impressionists at that moment. I mean, there was something very, very ambitious and something that sort of blurred the line between what might be a more traditional academic painting and what was full-blown Impressionism. This is the most extraordinary view. I mean, we're seeing the protagonist of the painting from behind. I mean, we can't see his face. We don't know precisely what he's thinking, what he's looking at, what his expression is as he's looking. This was a painting that, for me, injected something into Impressionist art that I'd never seen before, and that was psychology. I wrote my thesis on him, and I wrote about Caillebotte, his paintings of domestic interiors. It was phenomenal to me to find a male artist of the period who was so interested at looking at the domestic interior. Most of the male Impressionists were out on the streets or out in the country, and Caillebotte, quite unlike the rest of them, was particularly interested in the interior, his own interior, in fact. I mean, what we're looking at is the family apartment here. So there's a really personal element to this.
Can we ask what grade you got on this paper?
It was fine.
I mean, obviously, this was such a rich instigator for you, and I'm sure in the intervening years you have developed and evolved the way you've been thinking about Caillebotte. And I just want to bring up this picture here, and I wonder if you could say a few words about it.
This is Paris Street, Rainy Day. It's a gigantic painting, unlike any Impressionist work ever produced. And I think it's a work that I arrive at work every day and I walk past this painting, and there's nothing more exciting than living with this painting now. This painting, which when I was thousands of miles away in Sydney, I'd looked at so carefully, fallen in love with, and to live with it every day now is, it's pretty special.
Well, talking about things you would live with every day, may I pose the next question, which is, what is the one work of art in the world that you would want to live with every day? You already live with Caillebotte, so that's out of the question.
So I worked at the Met a few years ago, and there was one little sculpture in a sort of forgotten room of 18th century art on the ground floor, and easily overlooked. It's about so high. And I just completely and madly fell head over heels for it. And I try to go and look at it as often as possible. I think you know, Amy, that I have a soft spot for sculpture in my heart. And when I was thinking about something I'd like to live with, I didn't want some bomb. I'm not going to live with Paris Street rainy day. I mean, I don't have the wall space, and B, I feel like we truly want to live with personal things, and this is on a scale that I would live with forever. And it is a bozzetto or model for a much larger sculpture by the artist Ignaz Günther, who was great South German Rococo sculptor of the mid-18th century. And what I love about it is the epitome for me of what is great about sculpture. I mean, this is a work that takes full advantage of its three-dimensional form. If you can just imagine picking it up and turning it around in your hand, there's this sort of sense that the work will come to life or unfold in an almost cinematic way through this kind of infinite possibility of viewpoints.
Well, funnily, I was looking in your wonderful Zoom background. I was looking at your mantle there, and this would sit perfectly on that mantle, but you would want to pick it up all the time and turn it around and see the other side. It wouldn't be something that you could leave alone, I think, because as you're saying, it doesn't have one view, right? But I'm imagining this on the mantle, and then you've got your lovely reading armchair behind you. So I'm going to move us to the next question, because I'm imagining you looking here, sitting with your glass of wine, looking at this sculpture, and in your hand, what is the book that we're going to talk about? A book and a piece of music, but what is the book that inspires you the most?
It's The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, who was Trollope was a late 19th century British writer. He's kind of infamous for being a bureaucrat by day and novelist by night. And so he's kind of the opposite in the sense of that kind of romantic conception of the artist that, who has the calling, who doesn't do anything else. I mean, he had a day job, which I kind of love. And, this novel was probably the last great serialized novel of the 19th century. And we think of that maybe as kind of old-fashioned today, but in fact, it's kind of the forerunner in a sense of the sort of the television shows that we watch,
totally.
The HBO Westworld or whatever. It's, wait for each weekly installment. It's a satirical novel that really deals with the kind of rise of a financially centered mode of existence in the 19th century. And in that way, I think today it seems more relevant than ever. And I think I first discovered it in the midst of the 2008 financial crisis. And it felt so relevant, so true to our times. I mean, the infamous main character of this novel, Augustus Melmoth, is basically the Bernie Madoff of the late 19th century. And, he's filthy rich, but no one quite knows where he got the money. He's sort of foreign, but no one knows quite where he came from. And he is involved in marketing this outrageous Ponzi scheme for railway shares. And you see the way his dramatic rise and fall and the way that his endeavor has an impact on those around him.
I'm going to move us to the second part of this question, which is, what's the piece of music that inspires you the most?
Well, this was easy. I mean, I didn't even have to think about this for a second. And I'm kind of, infamous for my patriotic and personal love of the great Australian star, Kylie Minogue, known around the world as the pop princess or the princess of pop, or more affectionately in Australia as the singing budgie. And I've grown up with this fabulous, stunning woman. She's been, heading the charts for decades now. She began in the 1980s as a soap star on the famous Australian TV show Neighbours. And I watched her transition to pop with such glorious hits as I Should Be So Lucky, 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 and Locomotion, which was her first #1 hit in America. Although today she's much more famous in Australia and Europe. And I have watched this woman transform her appearance. I mean, I've seen 80s Kylie, 90s Kylie, indie Kylie, space Kylie, now country Kylie, and I just can't get enough. And I think part of it is that for me, she's almost like a total work of art. It's not even completely about the singing at all. It's about the way that she presents herself visually to the world that I absolutely cannot get enough of.
It's very visual, right? As much as she is a music performer, it's so, all of her music videos, as you know, as we're watching right now, it's as much, we can watch this on silent and still get Kylie.
Oh, absolutely. And another great example is there's a video that she did many years ago with the great singer Nick Cave. And it's called Where the Wild Roses Grow. And the premise for the video was to recreate or riff off one of the most famous 19th century British paintings in existence, Millet's Ophelia. And I think you can see here a still from her music video with Nick Cave.
On the right.
Yes, next to although who knows, next to the painting itself. And, it's an extraordinary, for an art history nerd like me, engagement between pop culture of the past couple of decades and a sort of historical element from the 19th century.
I'm going to move on to our next question, which is about being overrated and underrated. And I'll start with which artist you find the most overrated.
It's a tricky question because we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say overrated? Do we mean that the artist has received too much critical attention? And, in that case, I think you could easily say someone like Edouard Manet from the 19th century. I mean, reams and reams of paper have been printed on this artist who, don't get me wrong, is amazing and fabulous. But, is he really so central to our theory and understanding of 19th century art? It's debatable. The other side of it is, are they overrated in terms of the market? And in that case, you could very easily, I think, argue that someone like Monet or Van Gogh or, Rodin are fetching prices that are beyond what is, adequate to their art historical importance, no matter how wonderful they may be. But someone who captures both of those elements, I think, is the appalling late 19th century French painter, William-Adolphe Bouguereau, who was, hands down the most famous academic French painter of the late 19th century. He was a very influential teacher as well. His paintings were discussed endlessly, critically, and also sold for gargantuan sums of money in his own time. And they have these sort of precious, perfect licked surfaces, which, you know, are part of the problem for me, because that is, you know, they're kind of like the embodiment of the commodity fetish. And they're works that are still extremely sought after today. I mean, they sell for millions of dollars a piece at auction today. There was an attempt in the 80s and 90s to kind of revive him critically, but I don't think it was
Where did that go?
I don't think it was particularly convincing. I mean, these are, you know, you can't save these works. You know, on the left, you have one of his late gigantic paintings, the Oreads, which is just this kind of mush of naked mountain nymphs doing Lord knows what with.
I believe they are flying, Emerson.
Because, you know, that seems natural and normal. You know, it's the kind of excess of a history of art that had revolved around the female form, I think, and it's taken to a limit which is a little hard to bear. There's something totally and utterly decadent about this. And what I particularly hate is it's totally irrelevant for the world in which it was made. It may be symptomatic of certain elements of 19th century culture, but it's not looking at that culture in any kind of critical way whatsoever. And that's what really gets my goat. And on the right, you see the other kind of work that, you know, you see endlessly on the market today. And that's, you know, these slightly pervy images of young peasant girls. This one is quite awfully called The Broken Pitcher. And it's obviously alluding to some kind of lost innocence / virginity. And that's, you know, it's just not okay.
I hear you. Why don't we move on to somebody who think is underrated, and let's celebrate that. So which is the artist that you find most underrated?
Well, right now, the automatic answer for me is Camille Claudel. And even in her day, people were speaking about her as if she had that kind of tragic artist. She fit that tragic artist mold that was only ever reserved for men. So it's very, very interesting to think about her and the idea of the romantic artist. She was perhaps the first female artist of the 19th century to sort of attain that kind of sense of what an artist was. And she was a student of Rodin, a collaborator of Rodin, mistress of Rodin, and you know, she had a breakdown in the early 19th century and was thrown into a mental asylum by her parents, completely against her will. I mean, they went to a doctor, and at that time you could go to a doctor about a female family member and just sign a form and your loved one would be institutionalized. I wish I'd known that growing up with my siblings. So the family institutionalized her around 1914, 1915, and she spent the remaining 30 years of her life in an institution, unable to make art, with very, very few visitors, correspondence.
Everything that we're looking at then, and I'm just going to show the next slide, everything that we're looking at was produced really in the first movement of her life, before the very tragic halfway point, let's say.
Exactly. And so it's devastating to think of what she may have become. Her early work is in sync with what Rodin was doing. A lot of people would say, oh, she was copying Rodin, or she's somehow just an extension of Rodin, but she wasn't. And it's very complicated because we have firm evidence of compositions that she produced that he appropriated for himself. So the relationship was very, very complex. But she really started to come into her own in the late 19th, early 20th century. And particularly with this work that you see here. I mean, for anybody that says Camille Claudel was kind of just, you know, a second-rate Rodin, I mean, look at this masterpiece. Rodin never did anything like this. This is called The Wave, and it shows her really coming into her own as a sculptor. And this is, for me, sculpture at its limit, sculpture on the edge. Yeah. I mean, why would you sculpt a wave? You know, sculpture, the whole thing about sculpture is that it is solid, it's static, it sits in one place. And here she is evoking marvelously the fluidity, the ephemerality, and the unpredictable wildness of the sea. In onyx, which is a hard thing to carve. And the perfect choice of color. You can almost see seaweed flowing in the green surf there, and these remarkable off-balance women who are they cavorting? Are they trying to save themselves from impending disaster? I mean, it's very, very unclear. And, you know, it's just, for me, one of those iconic late 19th century works that deserves to be so much better known. And actually, I've just started working on an exhibition of Camille Claudel for the Art Institute. I'm
so excited about your exhibition. And thinking about your responses today, I'm imagining this sculpture next to the Bouguereau. You know, two sides of the late 19th century. It's pretty extraordinary. I'm going to end with my favorite question, which is, if you could have your portrait made by any artist, who would that be? Well,
Ingres, for sure. One of my favorite artists of the 19th century. And ironically, you know, for an artist who despised portraiture, he created some of the greatest portraits in the history of art. And he's the Bronzino of the 19th century, right?
Yes, that green backdrop, I'm thinking of the Frick's Bronzino, in fact.
And you know what? It's funny because, you know, there was this debate in the 19th century that, you know, you were either for color or line, and Ingres was somehow totally on the side of line. And you can see why when you look at a painting like this. I mean, the lines themselves just take on lives of their own within the compositions. But, you know, these colors are pretty astonishing as well. I mean, that
it's in the same way that Bronzino, right? It's about line, but can you match Bronzino's colors? It's very difficult.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. And I think that, you know, there's a kind of haughtiness that Ingres is so good at capturing, which I'd like to think that he could hopefully do for me, because I'm pretty useless. I mean, I'm not like that at all in real life. So if you can give me a little bit of, you know, fashionable dignity, I'd be very pleased.
Well, I'm going to make my last comment about your backdrop, and I feel like your sort of decoration in your home, which I'm seeing, that is it seems right out of an Ingres portrait. So you are ready, Emerson.
I'm trying, one step at a time.
I want to thank you so much for doing this with us. We miss you here in New York, and we send you our love to Chicago.
Oh, thank you so much.
Looking forward to your exhibition. All right, take care, Emerson.
You too.
Bye-bye.